What does ironing a shirt, playing video games, and working in the ER all have in common? Strangely enough, they're all activities that can induce flow state. You might have heard of flow state, and maybe you think of it as where time tends to move really fast, where you've been working on an email, you get in the zone, and suddenly a couple hours have gone by, you forgot to eat or use the bathroom. And yes, that is flow state, but many other activities also can induce flow. And that's something I was surprised about in my research. I studied psychology in school, but I even thought flow was maybe only when you were dancing or playing a sport. And I didn't realize that almost any activity can induce flow. Now, there are exceptions that we will get into. In this episode, we're going to talk about what is the criteria and the characteristics of flow so that we firmly understand the definition. And to do that, we will turn to, I have a good old-fashioned positive psychology textbook, so we'll be looking at the real deal for this. We will also ask the question, does flow contribute to well-being and make us happier? Because this is part 5 in our series on happiness and positive psychology. And if it does increase happiness levels, spoiler alert, it does, how do we create more flow in our lives? Welcome to Immersion, 30 minutes beneath the surface. Let's dive in. So to start this out, I think it would be important for us to leave the experience of only being in our heads and in the research and get into our body and our experience, because flow truly is an embodied experience. And that's partly why we're covering this after last week's episode on health and our body's impact on our happiness levels. So think of a time recently, whether you were immersed in a book, whether you were in nature, out dancing, it could be anything, playing a game, and try to call to mind, whether you pause or you're just doing it right now as I talk, what that was like. Try to see if you can define flow state or what the characteristics might be. I will tell you about my recent experience of flow state, and that was snorkeling off the coast of Okinawa in the Pacific Ocean. From the cold ocean when you jump in your wetsuit to the hundreds of colors of fish. I think immediately when I jumped in, I saw a pufferfish not long after, which I had only seen in aquariums before. But you're just taking in so much newness. I thought I saw a barracuda, but turns out it was what's called a needlefish, which is a very, very long fish and has these razor sharp looking teeth. And everything was so different, not only compared to the oceans where I grew up in Florida, but also just you're going from above ground, this speedboat racing by the mountains, the wind in your hair, to underwater, seeing this completely different reality, seeing a sea snake go right by you and try to just breathe. And mind you, we were snorkeling. We were not scuba diving. I imagine when you scuba dive, you see way more. And so we were out there for an hour and time moved very fast. It was suddenly was over. We went back the next day. They were a bit surprised. I don't think most people do this activity twice. Like where we were staying, they were like, "Oh, you want to do it again?" And it's like, yeah, that was the coolest thing I've ever experienced. I want to do it again for sure. It also moved slow because our senses were heightened and we were very in our body. Wasn't thinking about anything else because I also felt like I needed to remain alert. I did not see sharks or anything, but technically anything could have been there, and the unknown kept us very alert. So let's now quickly pivot back to flow state. What is flow state? How do we define it? Now, there are 3 criteria, and like we talked about, 6 characteristics. I'll go ahead and pull those up now. So it requires a clear goal, not too easy, but not too challenging. And it also requires unambiguous feedback. So this might sound confusing to someone because, well, what's the clear goal of snorkeling? But it did have a clear goal. It was to take in a new experience, to be present, and to remain safe from things like sea snakes. And so that brings us to the next point, not too easy and not too challenging. If there was a great white shark that was within eyesight, that would move into the area of too challenging. I would not have been flow. I would have moved into anxiety or panic. And this would apply to if you were playing a game, for instance, and you started playing against someone that was a professional. When you're an amateur, you would not be in flow because the challenge would be too great. However, if the challenge is too easy, or I would assume not stimulating enough, for instance, if I was snorkeling in a pool, I might get a bit bored at a certain point because there's not as much of a challenge there. And similarly, if you were playing that same game against someone that had never played before and you had played quite a bit, you would not be in flow state anymore because it would be not interesting enough. So this is a huge part for flow, is being at that middle point between some like arousal or stimulation, but then also not being anxiety provoking. And this connects to that Yerkes-Dodson law that we talked about a few episodes ago, that optimal arousal state. But here it has to do with entering flow versus just finding that equilibrium. Now, the last criteria is unambiguous feedback. So it's really hard to get into flow if you have no idea if what is happening is right or wrong or progressing. So an example of that would be playing a game where the rules change every 30 seconds and you have no idea what is going on. So pure chaos cannot induce flow. Now, let's go into what's even more interesting, in my opinion, which is the characteristics and how it affects people. Intense concentration, you're very focused. That's the in the zone component. Loss of consciousness. And by that, I don't mean you're passing out. Loss of particularly self-consciousness. You're not thinking, do I look okay while I'm snorkeling? No, you're just snorkeling. You're present. But you're also not thinking about your mortgage or your taxes or insurance plans. You are present. That's one reason why it feels so good and it increases happiness. Another aspect is time is distorted. Now, I have heard it usually moves faster. So, for instance, that hour snorkeling might have felt like 10 to 15 minutes because it flew by because we were so immersed in it. Now, you might hear me say immersed a few times, and this topic is one that is particularly close to my heart because the title of the show is Immersion, and that is extremely intentional. Being so focused on a topic or idea of interest that you feel immersed in it is my goal for this, both in my research and when you're listening to the show. So I just wanted to share that this is a particularly heartfelt topic this week. Lastly, with the time aspect, it does not always move faster. And for instance, you might have been in flow state where it almost feel like time slows down because you're able to adapt quickly. I sort of think of maybe someone that's like doing some boxing or something. It's like they feel like they're able to move at the right pace. It's like it might slow down, like they see the glove coming at them and they're able to adapt. And that's another thing is merging. The next one is merging of action and awareness. And so you're not necessarily thinking about what you're doing. You're very in your body, and it's almost like your mind, your body, your actions, what you're aware of is all like coming together in this very unified way. And that's another reason it feels so good. Another aspect is a sense that you can control your actions. You're in control enough. So if we go back to that boxing example, it would not be very flow-inducing to feel like you were an uncoordinated mess of limbs, having never done this, boxing someone that's very skilled. So some level of control is needed. And that's why I did read in the text that usually it's easier to get into flow when you have some level of experience in what you're doing. But the neat part is that we will subconsciously, I think it's subconsciously, but also maybe on purpose too, adapt to find the right level for ourselves. So if we were maybe trying to paint something and it was too complex and we kept repeatedly feeling like we were failing at it and it was frustrating, we might try to paint something a little bit easier next time. and then get into that flow state. And that's just something we naturally do. And vice versa with finding more difficult challenges if something's too easy. The last characteristic is that it is intrinsically rewarding. You want to do it for the sake of doing it. You might dance in your living room with the music on and get lost in it, not because you're going to get some prize for being an award-winning dancer, but because you want to. Now, you might happen to get extrinsic rewards for what you're doing. So for instance, there could be an athlete that's in flow during the competition who might happen to get a reward, but flow itself is intrinsically rewarding. Now, what's interesting is not all of these characteristics have to be at play necessarily, but the criteria do. Let's get into some interesting exceptions or questions you might have. Oh, but first, we need to give credit to the father of flow. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a Hungarian-American psychologist who also was one of the original researchers helping to develop the field of positive psychology. Now, one of the questions we had in the beginning was, does flow state actually increase happiness levels? And the answer is yes. It is described in quite a bit of this research I did for this as an optimal experience. And I know that you've experienced flow, and I know that you have experienced it as an optimal experience. And we'll get into a little bit later the reasons why it increases happiness, but just to validate that it is one of the things we should be focusing on, like we talked about in the first episode of this series on positive psychology, there is a framework called PERMA Plus. That is about 9, if we count the 3 in the plus section, factors that we should be focusing on to increase our happiness levels. And E is for engagement, and that is being engaged in what we are doing or flow. So it is like, you could think of it as 1 out of 9 main things you should be focusing on to increase happiness levels. That's how important it is. I used to think of it as sort of this side aspect, maybe 1 out of 30 things that could kind of matter. But no, it's important. And that's why we're giving it a whole episode. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was the researcher that really pushed this work forward. So again, he was a positive psychology researcher. That was his entryway. And then he found flow makes a huge difference. How do we add more of that to people's lives? Finally, while we're in the historical lens for this, we can zoom out a lot further. Western scientists did not invent this. They just are coming up with more data and experiments and terms for it. But this is something that has been known about for thousands of years. For instance, Taoist philosophers have always talked about this effortless action. And that's something we could always talk about with a different guest expert down the line, because I believe that their understanding of flow would be very different. But right now, we're just pulling a lot more from Western research within positive psychology. So let's now get to some common questions people might have and really parse out what counts as flow state. So another key aspect that we touched on a little bit earlier is the idea of a clear goal and getting feedback. So I used to not understand this because I thought, oh, well, this is why things like a sport can put you in flow state or playing chess, because you quickly understand, oh, I hit the ball with that different technique and it didn't go over the net. I need to adjust my follow through. Or that move did not set me up well in chess. I will remember to keep an eye out for knights more next time. So this is not the only way we get immediate feedback. For instance, if you are a writer, oh, that was a good sentence. That sits right in my bones and that clicked. Versus, it just doesn't quite sound right. Like if you practice saying it out loud and it feels clunky, you need to rework it. This is another reason why having some level of experience helps you get into flow a little bit better. And now a couple more surprising facts before we get into how flow increases happiness levels and how we can create more in our lives, which is what we will end on. One thing that I also found surprising is, like we talked about in the beginning, this was a quote from my textbook, which was written by the researcher I keep referring to, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and Jeanne Nakamura. In the text, there is a quote that says, "Sports games and other flow activities provide goal and feedback structures that make flow more likely, but one can find flow in almost any activity, even working a cash register, ironing clothes, or driving a car." This is where the idea of how we approach the activity is also a determinant for if we will enter flow. For instance, I had mentioned I would be less likely to enter flow if I was swimming in a pool rather than in that Pacific Ocean with my snorkels and fins. But that is, in this way, not true. If I was extremely present with my technique, with my breath, with the way the water felt, with how my body is interacting with this space, and it becomes a meditation and we can enter flow. This is how you could enter flow, like the textbook said. Ironing clothes, like I mentioned in the beginning, you might really think, oh, how do I move this so that there is even less of a wrinkle along the collar? And you can bring a presence into almost everything you do. And this brings us to the idea that some people are more likely to do this than others. Flow comes easier to some people. This is what the text refers to as a autotelic personality. They're someone that's generally curious and interested in life, they're persistent, and they have low self-centeredness, which makes sense because if someone was really caught up in if they're doing the right thing and how they look, it would be hard to enter flow where there is that loss of self-consciousness. So I think that there's a bit of a cyclical factor here. The people that enter flow get the benefit of being less self-conscious, but it's hard to enter flow if you're very self-conscious. So we'll get a bit more into that in a moment, but let's now talk about the benefits of flow. One is just that, the loss of self-consciousness. And like we talked about, it's not only of yourself, but also of other problems or thoughts or anything else. Like again, you're in the moment. So there's a meditative benefit, which we all know that meditation can affect well-being too. And I'm going to power through a bunch of others right here. One component is mastery and confidence in belief in your skills. So just that it feels good to be improving at something. And I don't think it's just in the capacity of, oh, I now have this skill. It's almost like you're refining and working on yourself and your character as you refine your craft. And going off of that skill development, the A in PERMA for that positive psychology framework is accomplishments. It's a lot easier to have accomplishments, to have mastery if you're able to get in the zone and focus on things and skills. So not only do you get the intrinsic reward of doing something that you like, which is another reason it increases happiness, you also get the benefit of having improved at something and how that benefits your life. Bit of compound interest there. The next benefit is one that I think is the most powerful. I'm going to read from the textbook. And by the way, this is the Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology by Shane Lopez and C.R. Snyder. Oh, Charles R. Snyder. I referenced him in 2 episodes ago. I think the field of positive psychology is actually a little bit smaller than I realized, which is really cool and fulfilling during this series, seeing the same researchers pop up. Anyway, okay. Here's another benefit of flow that I find really powerful. When attention is completely absorbed in challenges at hand, the individual achieves an ordered state of consciousness. Thoughts, feelings, wishes, and actions are in harmony. Subjective experience is both differentiated and integrated, defining the qualities of a complex phenomenon. Okay, I think a lot of this is getting, we've talked about the CBT triangle in other episodes in this series. Essentially, your thoughts, feelings, what you're doing, all of that is integrated. You feel whole, you feel aligned. Meaning, let's take the snorkeling example. I'm in the water. I'm thinking about what I'm doing there. My body is there. I'm present in it. I'm taking the action of swimming and looking around me at the experiences. I am feeling energized and focused and present. And normally we're in a slightly scattered or disoriented state without realizing it. We might be doing the dishes, but thinking about something else and having a lingering annoyed feeling at something that happens earlier. And this alignment is, I think, probably the biggest benefit of flow. And again, when you're completely engrossed in something, you know how good that feels. The last two reasons why it can make us happier is we're doing something that generally will often bring us more joy. I think often we don't have enough play. We don't have enough creativity in our lives. Often these things are done either intentionally solo or intentionally in community. So we're being thoughtful about who we're surrounding ourselves with. We might be exercising. We're often doing things that have another benefit to another area of our life, not just mastery, but play, fun, maybe community, movement. So there's often we're doing something like this talks about where there is an intrinsic reward. And I think that there can even be many in the activities of flow state. And the last reason that flow state can be tied to happiness has to do with more philosophy. We have talked about throughout this series hedonic versus eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness being on the couch, scrolling through social media, numbed out, eating cookies. Nothing wrong with that. We need a certain amount of time to recharge, and that can look however you want it to look. But if we spend too much time there, in a very passive state of life versus an active and engaged state of life, we do not have enough eudaimonic happiness to have meaning and feel like we are in control of our lives, steering the ship where we want to, and finding purpose and fulfillment along the way. Now, Aristotle and many believed that this was integral to being a happy human and being fulfilled. From what I've read, he described happiness being something that's more active. We could think of it like as a verb or what we pour into, what we do, and then we derive some happiness from that versus passively sitting back and letting it wash over us. And I think that that is a huge part of happiness in this series that I want to get across is often people might think, oh, happiness can come to me from the outside. And flow state is the opposite of that. Thinking, oh, I'm going to get this car and it's going to make me happy, instead of I'm going to pour myself into this thing that matters to me. And through that, probably find a lot of joy and meaning along the way. Flow is greatly tied to that. In fact, here is a beautiful quote from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He says, optimal experience is thus something that we make happen. For a child, it could be placing with trembling fingers the last block on a tower she has built, higher than any she has built so far. For a swimmer, it could be trying to beat his own record. For a violinist, mastering an intricate musical passage. For each person, there are thousands of opportunities and challenges to expand ourselves. This is from his book, Flow, which I have not read. I only read his chapter in this textbook, but I do plan to read his book, Flow, or other pieces of his work down the line. I imagine we'll do a follow-up down the line as well. And by the way, if you would like to throw out questions for that, suggestions of different directions we could take it, please write in or call into the show or comment on YouTube. I'll link all those links down below. For instance, we could talk about integrating more flow at work. We could talk about different cultural aspects like we talked about earlier. We could do more of a book club one where we dive into his book on flow. There's a lot of different directions we could take it. And I was texting with someone before recording this to see, how do you think of flow? And she said, I think of it as anything I would get annoyed if someone distracted me from. And I think that is really relatable. For instance, when I sit down to write a script for this, I cannot sit down if I only have 20 minutes because I will feel my alarm or just the clock pulling me out before I'm ready, kind of like when you get woken up when you're in the middle of a dream. And so while we can do bite-sized chunks, or we probably could find flow even if the kid is in the other room trying to get your attention at certain points, I would imagine that it's a lot easier if you have a certain chunk of uninterrupted time. That's not something that I researched. That kind of leads us to ways to increase the times that we're in flow and improve our ability to get into flow. One way is to apply that meditative, focused outlook to more things that we're doing. For instance, I was surprised to see in reading for this that someone could find flow driving a car. If you're paying attention to how the road feels under you, if you're paying attention to the technique when you turn to try to even glide more smoothly into a turn, if you're trying to be present with what's around you and also the road right in front of you, you could get into flow state, even though the challenge might not be very high. Now, of course, the challenge could be high when you're driving. Maybe you've never driven in New York City before, and now you are, and now you have to be real alert of different things. But the point is even when the challenge is low, you can increase your presence and increase your likelihood of being in flow. Now, again, that might be more of those micro flow moments. You're probably not going to stay in flow for a very, very long time doing something easier. To stay in flow for a long chunk of time, that would be more when the challenge is higher and your skill is higher. That's when it's easier. Another way to increase our ability to be in flow is to find more examples both in and out of work. For instance, out of work, you might have a hobby or interest that you dedicate a bit more time to. So maybe instead of spending 2 hours watching your favorite shows after work, maybe you bring that down to even just an hour and 15 minutes with shows or books or something before bed. And then you might have 45 minutes for something that you enjoy that brings you into flow state after work. Everyone's schedule and time commitments are different, but pouring into something like guitar, woodworking, gardening, playing a sport in a league, anything you can do to have outlets for flow could increase that time. And it doesn't have to be every day. Even something that you're adding once a week, I think could still contribute greatly to your happiness levels. Now, another thing you can do is adding more flow at work. An example of this would be finding a skill you want to improve and focusing on improving it. Like we had talked about, there needs to be feedback, there needs to be a clear goal. So an example of this from my life is that I do work as a strength coach. And I've done this for over 10 years. I've been working out in gyms for way longer than that even. And it's pretty easy to teach someone how to do a dumbbell bent over row. I'm going to talk about sliding the shoulder back. I'm going to talk about bringing it closer to their hips, so it's not just going up but back. I'm going to talk about engaging their rhomboids and lats and locking their wrists so they don't curl using their forearm instead. And I have a checklist of maybe 10 points to bring up, and I know how to touch their shoulder blade to get their back to activate more, and it's pretty easy to go into autopilot while I'm doing this. Instead, what if I occasionally want to work their core more, and I teach them how to do a bird dog row, the other leg's up. They're having a hard time balancing. What weight is right for this person that's never done this exercise before? And while I've not done this, I've also seen people put a small weight on that person's back leg. So then suddenly the glute's having to fire more. Now you have 2 different weights you're having to integrate and your core. And suddenly I'm now having to be much more present. I'm improving a new skill. I'm not just thinking about what their body's doing, but how am I communicating? And how can you do this at work? How can you find a skill to improve? And I think for some jobs, it might be easier to find things. And for some jobs, it might be harder, but like the textbook said, it can be possible in any line of work. And we can also increase flow by making a game out of things. How can you sort of gamify different stuff that you're already doing? Or how can you raise or lower the challenges accordingly to get into that sweet spot? And I also hadn't thought about this until just now filming, but how can you also define more clear goals in no matter what you're doing, whether it's at work or at home? For instance, maybe you're cleaning the bathroom and you think, you know what, I'm going to try to get these tile grouts more clean than I ever have before. Let me research a new technique for that. Oh, wow, I'm getting a lot of fulfillment out of doing this in a slightly new way. Now, I bet that this would be tough. So I'm not at all saying that it's probably easy to find flow in no matter what we do. Just saying it could be an interesting way to try to add more of it. Oh, and the last way to add more flow is to work on sort of personal attributes that can make it easier or harder to find flow. So like we talked about, the autotelic personality is someone that happens to find flow easier. And the book talks about sort of meta skills to enter flow and stay in it. So this was talking about curiosity, persistence, and less self-centeredness. If you want to increase your curiosity, I think realizing how much we don't know in an area. So this goes back to a quote I saw by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi as well. He said, if you're interested in something, you will focus on it. If you focus attention on anything, it is likely that you will become interested in it. Many of the things we find interesting are not so by nature, but because we took the trouble of paying attention to them. It's an interesting loop. When we're curious, we pay attention. And when we pay close attention, we get more curious. So there's a beautiful cycle there. Similar to the cycle that I had talked about with thinking of ourselves. As we drop the moments of thinking about ourselves and get in the present moment, it's easier to be in flow. When we're in flow, we think of ourselves less. Now, I do think that there is a space for therapy and some of these things we've been talking about in this series, maybe working with a professional, other techniques to help reduce some of that mental chatter in our head that might be from trauma or genetic components. But something I found interesting in the book was that they did also talk about flow as a form of therapy, which I think is really beautiful and cool. It kind of reminded me of maybe, art therapy or something like that. That would be an interesting type of therapist to have on the show one day. Last two caveats here, and then we'll close out. One thing that was a bit confusing, I think, for researchers is what they called the work paradox, where people would find more flow at work, but often more satisfaction when they were doing leisure activities that were more relaxing and not as flow-inducing. So that was real shocking that people were sometimes happier when they were not at work. But I do think it is a bit of a paradox because we are happy when we're in flow. And I think sometimes we might even be happier on work days because we're engaged versus sometimes we can almost feel numbed out, lower energy on the days we're not at work. But we do need a certain percent of time that we're relaxing and a certain percentage of time that we're engaged. So that's something that research also pointed to, is that more flow isn't always necessarily better, or doesn't make you happier in every single moment. And another example of that was things that could be addictive, such as video games, which can be very flow-inducing, but more and more video games is not always a good thing. The last thing that might help before we close out is the idea that if you associate flow state with very specific experiences from earlier in your life, for instance, someone that maybe was a skateboarder, they were kind of used to extreme sports as their way of finding flow. As an adult, if that was all they associate flow state with, they might have a hard time finding flow at later points in their life. So we might have to change our notions of what flow is in our mind so that we can find it in new areas. I will close out with a couple other reasons why flow is so important to me personally and why it might be important to you as well. So as this relates to grit in a past episode and mastery, which is coming up in a future episode, so much of what it means to be human is not just realizing our potential, but challenging it, pushing it beyond its borders, and realizing that happiness is not found through consumption or even just relaxing in our hobbit hole, but it is when we venture into the unknown, and that's found at the edge of the comfort zone where we're walking the line between skill and challenge.
Coming into the edit really quick, next week we're going to talk a lot about deliberate practice, but just one note, if you're trying to learn a new skill and you're pushing beyond your current capabilities, you will not always be in flow. Often in deliberate practice, you are working on something and the challenge is so great, or you're working on a weak area, it is not pleasant. So we cannot always expect to be in flow in every single work session. And that's okay. And even in a work session, we might go in and out of flow. Also, I apologize. I'm super nasally because I'm sick, but back to the episode.
To finish, we'll look at a quote by William Butler Yeats, who said, "O body swayed to music, O brightness glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance?" In flow, the separation between you and the deed, the activity, the dance you're doing, it disappears and you become your writing. You become practically the wave you're surfing on. There's this merging where we don't just feel in our body. I think we also feel part of the physical world and connected to everything around us in a really magical way. It's easy to keep all of this in our head when we're looking at the research, but flow is in the body. And it's in the experience. And there's a magic in that I think can't be captured in research or in a textbook. And that's where some of that ancient wisdom comes in. So while the data matters, I think what matters most is how you feel in these moments. And that's going to help you want to create more of them. Thank you so much for being here. And I appreciate you immersing yourself in all of these topics together that you show up for. And if you found this interesting or helpful, you can share it with a friend and have a discussion with them about it this week. See you next week in part 6, which will be on work and mastery, which is clearly connected to this. Have a great week.